in the quiet back room of a small-town office supply store where the ticking of a wall clock was the loudest sound for hours on end, Mildred sorted paper clips, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. For 38 years, Mildred had lived a life of gentle routine, her world measured in penciled lengths and envelope sizes. She never rushed, never worried, and never changed course. This is not the story of excitement or adventure. This is a story about what happens when absolutely nothing happens, and how that can be a comfort worth falling asleep to. ***, Mildred's mornings started just as they always did, with a soft stretch and a long yawn that carried through the quiet of her small, cluttered bedroom. The clock read 7 a.m., and the sun was barely peeking through the curtains. She didn't need an alarm, for her body knew exactly when to stir. Slowly, she sat up in bed, allowing her feet to touch the cool floor. She stood, shuffled to the bathroom and splashed water on her face, then ran a brush through her hair, every motion deliberate and calm. Afterward, Mildred walked to the kitchen where a kettle was waiting to be filled. The quiet hum of the kettle soon filled the room as she prepared a pot of chamomile tea. She didn't take sugar. She never had. For her, the tea was perfect just as it was, its warmth seeping into her bones. She sat at the small kitchen table and sipped slowly, allowing the moment to linger. No rush, no need for hurry. The morning was quiet. The birds outside were singing softly, and the world beyond her window seemed to move in slow motion. In these moments there was only Mildred, her tea, and the soft morning light that crept across the kitchen table. The day hadn't begun, not really, but it was about to. And so, she took another sip, savoring the peace before the world outside started. Its gentle hum. Mildred's walk to the office supply store was just as routine as everything else. She stepped out of her front door at precisely 8 a.m., adjusting her cardigan against the cool morning air. The street was calm, a soft breeze rustling the leaves of the trees as she walked. She passed Mrs. Jenkins' house, where the mailbox leaned a little too far to the left. She always noticed that, and it made her smile. She passed the bakery, its windows fogged up with the scent of fresh bread, but she didn't stop. She never did. There was no need. The shop was only a few blocks away, and Mildred knew every crack in the sidewalk and every lamppost by heart. She didn't need to look where she was going. Her steps were slow but steady, each one taken with purpose, though there was no rush. The birds still sang, and the sky above was a light shade of blue, the kind that was neither too bright nor too dull. It was perfect, just like every other morning when she reached the office supply store. She stood for a moment in front of the door, taking a deep breath before unlocking it. The store wasn't busy, not yet, but it would be, in time. It always was. Mildred unlocked the door with a practiced twist of the key. She entered the store, letting the door click behind her. The air inside was still cool, though it would warm up as the day went on. The lights flickered on one by one, illuminating rows upon rows of shelves stocked with pens, pencils, notepads, and every other office supply imaginable. It was a quiet, calm place. Everything was in its place. She set her bag down on the counter, adjusted the chair behind it, and pulled out the small notebook where she kept her to-do list. Mildred never had a long list. There was never much to do. A few stock shelves, organized pens, check the inventory. Simple things. But things that, to Mildred, were important. Routine was her comfort, and in this small store, she found it in abundance. She began her day by dusting the shelves, a task that seemed never-ending but always satisfying. Each shelf was methodically wiped down, each pen checked for smudges. She moved from shelf to shelf, ensuring everything was in its place. No clutter, no mess, just order. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, a comforting sound that matched the rhythm of her work. Mildred reached for the inventory list. It wasn't long, just a few pages, but it was enough. She scanned the list, marking off items that needed to be restocked: paper clips, printer ink, file folders, all things Mildred had ordered 100 times before. She knew exactly where each item went, and she knew exactly how many boxes of each to order. Everything was predictable. Everything was the same. The inventory wasn't complex, and neither was the work. But Mildred took her time with it. She double-checked every number, every box. It was important to her that everything was correct. Everything had to be in order. The store would remain calm, as long as she kept it that way. She worked in silence, with only the occasional rustling of paper or the soft tap of a pen on the counter. The world outside seemed distant, as though it had faded away completely. There was only Mildred, the inventory list, and the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above her. At 12 p.m., Mildred took her lunch break, just as she always did. She made a small sandwich, nothing fancy, just cheese and lettuce on whole wheat bread. She sat at the back table in the break room, the sound of the sandwich being unwrapped the only noise in the room. She sipped water from a glass, and for a moment, she simply looked out the window, watching the leaves flutter in the breeze. She didn't rush her lunch. She never did. It was her time to unwind, her time to pause and reflect. There was no rush to return to the store. There was no hurry in Mildred's world. She finished the sandwich slowly, savoring each bite. The clock ticked away, marking the minutes, but Mildred didn't mind. Time moved slowly in her world. There was no need for it to speed up. The clock on the wall ticked steadily as Mildred stood behind the counter. The soft, rhythmic sound of the ticking hands filled the air. A constant companion in the store, always steady, always predictable. It was the kind of ticking that didn't demand attention, just quietly marking time. Mildred had long stopped noticing it consciously, but in the silence of the shop, it was always there. A soft backdrop to her every movement. The doorbell jingled softly as the first customer of the afternoon walked in. Mildred looked up and smiled, her face always calm, always welcoming, but never hurried. She didn't need to rush. The store was never busy enough to demand it, and even if it was, she would have kept the same pace. Mildred had learned long ago that everything was more peaceful when done slowly, deliberately. The customer was a woman in her 40s, wearing a denim jacket and a pair of well-worn boots. She looked around the store as though seeing it for the first time, her eyes flicking over the shelves filled with pens, paper, and other office supplies. Mildred had seen this look before, the initial curiosity followed by a sense of contentment. When they realized there was nothing flashy in the store, just quiet, reliable products that worked as expected. "Good afternoon. How can I help you today?" Mildred asked, her voice even calm. The woman smiled faintly, her gaze now fixed on the aisle of pens. "I'm looking for something smooth to write with," she said, her voice a little unsure. "You know, something that glides easily." Mildred nodded and stood up slowly, her movements measured. "Of course," she said. "We have a few options. Let me show you." She walked over to the pen display, the soft tap of her shoes against the linoleum floor the only sound in the store. As she reached the display, she began to sort through the pens with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. She lifted a sleek silver pen from the rack and turned it toward the woman. "This one," Mildred said, her voice quiet but confident. "It's a ballpoint, smooth writing, and lasts a long time. It's very popular with people who write a lot." The woman took the pen from Mildred, turning it over in her hands as if inspecting it for flaws. "It's nice," she said, nodding slowly, "but I'm looking for something with a little more flair, something that feels a bit more special." Mildred considered this for a moment. She didn't often think about pens in terms of flair, but she understood what the woman meant. There were pens that were more than tools for writing. They were an expression, a small luxury in the mundane act of putting ink on paper. Mildred walked a few steps down the aisle and picked up a darker pen, one with gold trim. "This one," she said, handing it to the woman, "has a bit more character. It writes smoothly, but it's also a bit more elegant." The woman smiled and tested the pen, making a few quick marks on a nearby pad of paper. "This is perfect," she said, her voice light. "I'll take it." Mildred rang up the sale, the soft beep of the register breaking the quiet. The woman paid, and as she left, she smiled and thanked Mildred. "Thank you for your help," she said. Mildred smiled in return, watching as the woman stepped out into the street, the doorbell jingling softly once again. The shop returned to its quiet state, with only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the steady ticking of the clock to mark the passage of time. Another customer, another transaction, and the same calm, steady rhythm. Mildred returned to her counter, smoothing the surface with a cloth. It wasn't much, but it was enough. This was what Mildred enjoyed most, the quiet interactions, the subtle ebb and flow of customers in and out of the store, always leaving behind a sense of peace. The world outside could be full of chaos, but in this small space, time moved slowly, and everything remained calm, just as it should be. The hours passed slowly, just as they always did. Mildred moved from task to task, each one simple and straightforward, yet important in its own way. She took her time with each item, carefully placing it where it belonged, adjusting its position until it was perfectly aligned with the others. There was something satisfying about the act of restocking the shelves. Each box of paper, each pack of pens was like a small puzzle piece, fitting perfectly into its spot. The store wasn't large, but it was well organized. Mildred had been working here for so long that she knew exactly where everything went, and if something ever strayed from its place, she could tell at a glance. It was a world of order and calm, a world where things were always in their proper place, and for Mildred that was enough. She moved down the aisles slowly, adjusting the boxes of paper and refilling the shelves with pens and markers. She didn't rush, there was no need. The store would be open for hours yet, and there was no reason to hurry. She enjoyed the quiet rhythm of the work, the way the shelves filled up once again with neatly stacked supplies. As she worked, she noticed a small detail that she hadn't seen before, a small crack in the edge of one of the wooden shelves. It was barely noticeable, but it was there, and Mildred took a moment to run her fingers over it, feeling the smoothness of the wood and the slight roughness of the crack. It wasn't a problem, just a small imperfection in an otherwise perfect space. She wondered how long it had been there, but she didn't bother to fix it. It wasn't important. The store would still function just as it always had, with or without the crack. It was part of the charm, really. Everything had its place, even the little imperfections. She continued her work. moving from shelf to shelf, organizing and adjusting. The store was slowly filling up with supplies once again, each item neatly stacked and ready to be used. As the clock ticked away the hours, Mildred moved through her tasks with calm precision, always at her own pace, always steady, always sure. The store grew quieter as the afternoon wore on. Mildred glanced at the clock and saw that it was nearly 5 p.m. soon. The last customer would leave, and she would close up for the night. She didn't mind. The end of the day was always peaceful, a time for reflection before the store opened again the next morning. Mildred had always liked this part of the day, the moment when the world outside seemed to fade away, and the store became a calm sanctuary. Just for her, she moved through the aisles one last time, making sure everything was in its proper place. The shelves were stocked, the floors were swept, and the counter was wiped clean. She checked the register, making sure it was balanced. Everything was ready for tomorrow. The doorbell jingled softly as the last customer entered, a young man who was in and out in a matter of minutes. He bought a pack of paper and a new pen, and with a polite thank you, he left. The store was empty now. Mildred locked the door behind him, the soft click of the lock echoing through the quiet shop. She walked to the back room, turning off the lights as she went. The store was dark now, the shelves bathed in soft shadow. Mildred turned off the register, checked the back door, and then stood for a moment in the stillness. The day had ended, and everything was as it should be. She took a deep breath, feeling the peace of the empty store settle around her. Tomorrow, the cycle would begin again, and she would be here, doing the same things, moving at the same slow pace. It was a comforting thought. As the clock on the wall ticked its way to 5 p.m., a soft murmur filled the store, the gentle sound of the doorbell as the last customer left for the day. The last fleeting moments of daylight entered the store, through the windows, casting a soft golden hue on the wooden shelves. Mildred, who had long since adjusted to the steady rhythm of her daily life, moved with quiet grace, tending to small tasks as the store began to empty. Each step felt like a small part of the story of her day, woven into the fabric of the familiar space around her. The store was calm now, a place of peacefulness, untouched by the outside world. With the customer gone, Mildred took a long, deliberate glance around the space she had spent so many years in. The shelves stood neatly arranged, each item exactly where it should be. Pens, paper, sticky notes, and binders all sat in their designated places, waiting for tomorrow when the cycle would begin again. There were no papers to shuffle, no hurried actions, no looming tasks, just the soft sound of the overhead fluorescent light buzzing quietly in the background. Mildred moved to the back room, her movements deliberate, each step taken with the kind of assurance that comes from repetition. The space behind the counter was small, cluttered in a way that felt comfortable. There was a simple chair, a table with a mug of cold tea, and her worn leather handbag tucked neatly on the side. Everything here, too, was as it should be. Mildred paused for a moment and adjusted her cardigan, her fingers running down the fabric in a small, almost absent-minded gesture. With a small sigh, Mildred reached for her bag and tucked it under her arm. She took one last look at the now empty shelves, the quiet air of the store pressing against her like a soft, comforting blanket. It was time to leave. The work for the day was done. She knew that tomorrow would bring the same routine, the same motions, the same quiet rhythm of life. Nothing would change. Nothing ever did. Mildred walked to the door, her hand steady as she reached for the key in her pocket. The key felt familiar in her hand, smooth and worn from years of use. She turned it with the same practiced motion she had used every day since she had first started working at the store. The door clicked softly, and she stepped outside, pulling the heavy door behind her. It was a small sound, the click of the door closing, but it was a sound that meant something. It meant that the store, her second home, was locked up for the night, and that the day was truly over. The cool evening air greeted her as she stepped outside, the weight of the day slipping away with each step. It was a quiet evening, much like any other. The street outside the store was calm, the only sounds coming from the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustling of leaves in the trees. Mildred didn't mind the quiet. She found peace in it. The world outside was full of noise and pursuing, but here, in her small corner of the world, there was only stillness. It was a stillness she had come to love, a stillness that filled the spaces between each moment, creating a kind of gentle peace that Mildred couldn't quite describe but felt deeply as she walked, her shoes clicking softly on the pavement. Mildred noticed the familiar houses lining the street. Each house was different, yet they all shared something in common, their simplicity. There were no grand estates, no towering mansions, just small, humble homes with well-kept gardens, and windows that glowed faintly in the evening light. Mildred didn't have a grand house of her own, but she was content with what she had. It was a small cottage, cozy and warm, tucked away on a quiet street. It was everything she needed. It was her home. With each step, Mildred felt the weight of the day's work begin to fall away. The tension in her shoulders eased, and the rhythm of her movements slowed. She didn't rush. There was no need to. The world outside was still, and the walk home was a time for reflection. A time for Mildred to gather her thoughts and prepare herself for the evening. As she walked, she thought about the store, about the customers who had come and gone, and about the tasks that awaited her the next day. But these thoughts didn't weigh her down. They were just thoughts, floating through her mind like leaves on a stream, moving slowly and without urgency. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, and the sky was turning a soft shade of indigo. The stars were just beginning to appear, twinkling faintly in the vast expanse of night. Mildred paused for a moment, looking up at the sky. It was always a comfort to her, the vastness of the sky, the way it stretched out endlessly above her. It made her feel small, in the best way possible, a tiny part of a much larger world, but a world that was calm and steady. She continued walking, passing the same familiar landmarks, the old oak tree at the corner, the stone bench by the fountain, and a small bakery that never seemed to close. It was a walk she had taken countless times before, and yet it never felt repetitive. Each step felt new, each moment a quiet meditation, a reminder that life was moving at its own pace, in its own time. When Mildred reached her home, she unlocked the door with the same key, the one she had carried with her for years. It felt good in her hand, like a small piece of familiarity. The door creaked slightly as it opened, and Mildred stepped inside, her senses immediately filled with the warmth of her home. The air smelled faintly of lavender and chamomile, the calming scent of her favorite flowers. The house was quiet, as it always was in the evenings. She closed the door behind her and stood for a moment, taking in the stillness of the space. Mildred's routine in the evening was simple. She removed her shoes, hung up her coat, and walked to the kitchen. The kettle was still warm from the cup of tea she had earlier in the day, and she filled it again with water, setting it on the stove to boil. As she waited, she moved to the window, looking out at the quiet street. The glow of streetlights cast soft shadows on the pavement, and the world outside seemed to slow down, just as her own movements did. The evening tea was always a quiet ritual. It was her way of unwinding, of letting the day slip away slowly. She poured the hot water into her mug and added a spoonful of honey, stirring gently. As the steam rose from the cup, she inhaled the soothing aroma, letting it fill her senses. The simple act of making tea, of watching the water change color, was enough to bring her peace. It was a ritual she cherished, one that marked the end of her day and the beginning of her evening. Mildred didn't have much in terms of excitement or adventure, but she didn't need it. She had everything she needed right here, in her small, quiet world. The tea, the stillness, the slow, steady rhythm of her life. It was all enough. She sat down at her small dining table, took a sip of her tea, and looked out the window once more. The street was empty now, the last traces of daylight fading into the soft embrace of night. Asterisk, asterisk. Creating a 9,000-word section will involve an extremely detailed and immersive description of Mildred's evening, from her arrival home to her final moments before sleep. The narrative will focus on slow, contemplative actions and reflections, extending the pacing of the story while keeping the tone calm and soothing given the nature of your request. A detailed 9,000-word section is quite extensive, to make sure the writing matches your expectations and remains calming for the sleep story format. I'll extend it in layers, maintaining Mildred's reflective and steady pace, allowing the words to flow seamlessly. I'll start the section and continue building out Mildred's actions and thoughts. Section 10. Bedtime 9,000 words. Part 1. The journey home. As the soft chime of the clock indicated the end of another workday, Mildred stepped out of the office supply store and into the quiet of the evening. The last few rays of sunlight were fading, and the world outside the store was slipping into twilight. The city felt different in the evening, quieter, more still. The hum of cars passing by, the distant chatter of people, all seemed muted under the soft sky. The temperature was cool now, a reminder that the day was closing, and night was on its way. The air smelled fresh, like rain, though it hadn't rained yet. It was just that kind of cool, evening air that carried the scent of things to come. Mildred moved at her usual pace, slow but steady, taking in the world around her. She passed by the same familiar houses, all in their rightful places, all unchanged. The houses were old, simple, but they had a charm to them. Each one had its story, though Mildred could only guess at those stories, never fully knowing the lives that passed through those doorways. It didn't matter, though she didn't need to know. The routine of her walk, of the evening's calm, was enough for her. Every night felt the same, and that was a comfort. It was her way of unwinding, of letting the world slip away as she stepped into the quiet of her home. Each house she passed was like a soft note in a familiar song. The creak of a porch swing here, the dim glow of a light on a neighbor's doorstep there. The world outside was familiar, and that was all Mildred ever needed. She never rushed. She had nowhere to be but home, and the journey itself was a form of rest. It was a time to unwind, a time to transition from the stillness of the store to the stillness of her own home. Part 2. The house and its comforts. When Mildred reached her front door, she took a moment to pause, just as she always did. She reached for the brass key in her pocket and unlocked the door with a slow, deliberate turn. It was the same key she had used for years. Its weight was familiar in her hand, the metal cool to the touch, the teeth worn smooth from the countless turns. As she stepped inside, the first thing she noticed was the quiet. It was always the same. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the whisper of the wind outside. The house greeted her with its stillness, and Mildred welcomed it with open arms. She closed the door behind her, locking it with a soft click. The world outside could keep its noise. Here, inside, there was only peace. Mildred removed her shoes, just as she always did, and placed them neatly by the door. She hung her coat on the hook beside the door, smoothing the fabric with her hands. As she did so, the house was just as she left it, clean, organized, and comfortable. There was a small vase of flowers on the kitchen table, a gift from a neighbor, their soft petals catching the light from the window. Mildred smiled faintly at the sight of them. It was a small thing, but it added a touch of warmth to the room, and she appreciated it. Little details like that made her feel connected to the world, even though she often kept to herself. Her eyes drifted to the window, where the evening sky was deepening into shades of purple and blue. It was beautiful, in a quiet way. The sky was never rushed. It just changed gradually, softly, as though it, too, had nowhere to be. Mildred often thought about the sky like that. It was always steady, always the same, but it held a kind of majesty in its quiet, unhurried transitions. She liked the idea that the sky didn't have to rush to get to its destination. It just was. Mildred moved to the kitchen, where the kettle sat waiting on the stove. She didn't have to think about it. She had made tea every night for years, the ritual so ingrained that it didn't need thought. She filled the kettle with water and set it on the stove, turning the dial too high. While it heated, she moved about the kitchen, tidying the counters, putting away the dishes. She hummed softly to herself, a quiet tune she had learned long ago and had long since forgotten the words to. It didn't matter. The song was familiar, just like everything else in her life. Familiarity was comforting. Part 3. Tea time. The kettle whistled softly, signaling that the water had boiled. Mildred lifted it from the stove, pouring the hot water into her favorite mug, the one with the chipped edge. She had never replaced it. It wasn't that she was attached to the chipped edge, but it was part of her routine. It had been with her for years, just like the kettle, just like the tea she drank every night. She added the tea bag, letting it steep for a few minutes before taking the first sip. The tea was warm, the taste rich and soothing. Mildred closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the warmth as it spread through her body. It was the kind of tea that didn't require anything else. No sugar, no milk, just the simple, calming flavor of chamomile. It was the perfect drink for the evening. The tea was Mildred's way of signaling to her mind and body that the day was over. The store was closed. The work was done. Now it was time to rest. Mildred sat at the kitchen table, her cup of tea held between her hands. She looked out the window again, watching the last traces of daylight disappear. The street outside was empty now, the soft hum of the evening filling the air. There was no need to go anywhere. There was no rush to do anything. All that mattered was this moment, the quiet, the tea, and the peace of the evening settling around her like a gentle blanket. Part 4. Reflection. Before sleep, the clock on the wall ticked quietly, marking the passage of time. Mildred's gaze wandered to the corner of the room where the light from the kitchen lamp cast a soft glow. The shadows were long now, stretching across the floor and the walls. The world outside felt far away, and in that moment Mildred realized how much she appreciated that distance. She didn't need to be part of the world outside. Here, in her home, there was peace. She took another sip of her tea, letting the warmth fill her. She thought about the day, the store, the customers, the familiar rhythm of her tasks. It had been a good day, just like all the others. Nothing had changed. Everything was where it was supposed to be. Mildred liked that. She liked knowing that, no matter what else happened, the day would end the same way. She would return home, make her tea, and sit in the stillness of the evening. The consistency of it all was comforting. Mildred stood up and carried her mug to the sink, rinsing it carefully before placing it on the drying rack. The house was quiet now, the only sound the faint rustle of the wind outside. It was time for bed, but Mildred wasn't in any hurry. There was no rush to end the day. The night would come when it was ready, and until then there was only the quiet, the stillness, and the gentle, rhythmic ticking of the clock. Part 5. The end of another day. Mildred walked to the bedroom, her steps slow and steady. She took off her cardigan and placed it neatly on the chair by the bed. She removed her shoes, setting them in the same place as always. Her movements were calm, deliberate. Each task was small, but important. She had no need to rush. There was nowhere to be but here. In this moment she climbed into bed, pulling the soft, cool sheets up around her. She adjusted the pillow just so, making sure it was perfectly aligned with the edge of the bed. The room was dark now, save for the faint glow of the streetlights outside. The gentle hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock were the only sounds in the house. It was a peaceful silence, the kind that only the night could bring. Mildred closed her eyes, taking a deep breath and letting the day slip away. There was nothing left to do. The world outside was still. Her house was still. And as she lay there, wrapped in the comfort of her bed, Mildred knew that tomorrow would bring the same quiet, unhurried rhythm, and for now, that was enough.